It's quite the running theme, isn't it, that perpetrators have often had a turbulent upbringing, in and out of foster homes. This is no different with today's case. Born on the 11th of August 1988, Jason Marshall's life fits the theme. Before we start, let me just say, I'm Harley. This is all I'm saying is. Here we tell true stories. On a Sunday it's true crime, and on a Wednesday it's stranger than fiction. A disclaimer before we start, this is a true story. It involves real people, and them real people have real families. So I do want you to share it, and I do want you to comment, but please do be sensitive as you do so. An extra one for this one, it is a little bit graphic in detail. It's not too graphic and there's no visual, but just bear that in mind. Jason Marshall's parents were drug addicts, and with them both in prison, at the age of 10, Marshall was in and out of foster homes. That being said, social services did allow him to return to living with his mom when she'd finished serving a sentence. At 12-year-old, Jason started seeing things and hearing things. Sometimes it were the aliens, sometimes it were the angels. At times, he even believed that he was the incarnation of Angel Gabriel. Throughout his teens, Jason hated himself. He felt he had no authority or purpose. He was a nobody. And he clearly saw that a uniform would give him a purpose, and it'd get him respect. And more importantly, it'd grant him authority. Having noticed that, he started to use uniforms. He once posed as an air cadet to steal charity collections. He dressed as a ticket inspector to issue fines on the London Underground. He caught criminals with an own-made warrant card. He pepper-sprayed his assailants. And he later claimed that he had been arrested for impersonating a police officer. In 2008, at the age of 20, he was sectioned after a suicide attempt, and he was sent to John Howard Centre for assessment. However, he absconded. He ended up spending a short amount of time in prison for a non-violent crime, and then he was monitored by the Dangerous and Severe Personality Disorder Service in 2010. Whilst being transferred to a specialist hospital, he absconded again, and he was returned to prison and fell off the scheme's radar. I don't know which time, because he obviously absconded twice, but one of the times that he absconded, he was missing for 3 weeks. In 2012, he got a job as a cleaner during the London Olympics, but he got fired, so he apparently took to travelling around London pretending to solve crime. He started drinking a lot, and his mental health got a lot worse. Apparently, during this time, he was also hiring himself out as a £400 an hour male escort. 58-year-old Peter Fasoli met Jason Marshall on a dating app called Badoo. It was arranged that Marshall would go around to Peter's on Sunday the 7th of January 2013. One report claimed they'd arranged a bondage sex session, but other reports also claimed that they'd arranged a threesome. Either way, at 7 PM on that Sunday night, Jason arrived at Peter's bungalow in Norfolk, London, and he was alone. Jason pretended to be an MI5 intelligence officer, arriving at the home with latex gloves, wearing a police belt equipped with handcuffs and a pistol holder. He informed Peter that he was under arrest for hacking and being a spy under the Espionage Act. He ordered Peter to strip and tied him up and gagged him, as well as using handcuffs apparently. Meanwhile, classical music played in the background. During the roleplay, Jason threatened to cut off Peter's tongue. This role, where it started to go massively wrong in Peter's eyes, I suspect, because he's now got this massive hunting knife and he's telling Peter if he doesn't give him his bank PIN code, he's going to cut his tongue off. Jason then apparently muttered, "Suspect detained," after injecting Peter with a drug to put you to sleep while I go to a cash machine. Jason then left the bungalow and made a number of purchases on Peter's card. Then he went back to Peter's bungalow. When he got back to the bungalow, Peter screamed that he couldn't breathe, and Jason just clapped his hand over his nose and put his arm around his neck. They struggled together on the bed as Jason produced a roll of cling film. Peter shouted, "No, no, please." Jason proceeded to wrap the cling film around Peter's face. He did this numerous times and it was really thick, and then he held a plastic bag over Peter's head for 1 minute and 42 seconds. After, Jason spoke into his fake or disconnected radio again, and he said, "Oscar 1 from Papa 4, ready for transport, over." Later, Peter was gurgling as Jason checked for a pulse, and he spoke into his radio once again to say, "Urgent ambulance required at my GPS location. Yeah, that's a lack of oxygen. And can I get them with a crash trolley, please?" As Peter Fasoli lay dying on the floor, Jason calmly stood and had a cigarette. He then made a sign of a cross and recited a blessing from the departed in Latin,
Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti,
and the word resurrection. He then gathered his belongings and splashed liquid around the bungalow. 41 minutes past 12 in the morning, Jason set the bungalow on fire and left. Jason went on to withdraw £780 from Peter's bank account and bought himself a return flight to Italy. To further cover his tracks, Jason then continued to message Peter on the Badoo app. He apologised for not turning up and then accused Peter of ignoring him. 4 days later, on Friday the 11th of January, at 10 to 7 in the morning, Jason Marshall boarded an EasyJet flight to Italy. But the return flight, which was on the 17th of January, he didn't catch back. He stayed in Italy. So now in Rome, Italy, on Saturday the 2nd of February 2013, the police were called to a home of 67-year-old tour operator Vincenzo Lale. It was his neighbours that had phoned the police because they noticed that the lights in his house had all been on for over a week, so they were concerned for his welfare. The police turned up, they went into his house, and they found Vincenzo dead on the floor. He was naked with a piece of electric flex around his neck. The hard drive of his computer had been removed, and his car had been stolen. It was later established that he had died a week earlier, on the 26th of January. His bank cards were missing and cash had been withdrawn, but there was no sign of a forced entry, so the police came to the conclusion that he must have known his attacker. Then the post-mortem later confirmed that he had died from a ligature around his neck. Keen to catch the murderer, the Italian police checked Vincenzo's phone. They found that he'd been in contact with a British man called Jason Marshall, which is quite interesting because when he was talking to Peter, he didn't use his name. The day after, on the Sunday the 3rd of February 2013, police started following Jason. We followed him to a flat, he went inside and they sat outside for several hours waiting for him to reappear. But he didn't reappear, and their shift ended, so they went home. But it weren't long after that the police would return to that flat. And the reason they returned is the neighbours of that flat reported screaming coming from within the flat. When the police got back to the flat, they discovered a man who was barely alive. He said his attacker was called Jason Marshall. Apparently this Jason Marshall had posed as a British embassy official, complete with fake ID, armed with an ulster, utility belt, pistol, pepper spray and a telescopic truncheon. He bound and gagged the man and then demanded cash. But neighbours were alerted by his screaming, so he fled, taking his mobile phone with him. Now Jason was already under surveillance, so it weren't hard for the police to track him down using his phone's GPS location and catch him. It didn't take the police long to get to Jason. When they did, they arrested him, and in his possession he had items to support his police identity disguise, he had personal items from the current victim, and items to link him to the murder of Vincenzo. Jason Marshall was arrested and charged with the murder of Vincenzo and the attempted murder of a 55-year-old male from earlier that night. On the 16th of August 2013, 7 months after the death of his first victim, Peter Fasoli, an inquest reached a verdict of accidental death. Fire investigators concluded that the fire had most likely been caused by a faulty LED falling from the ceiling onto bedding which were highly flammable. That were it, case closed. A year after Jason Marshall had been arrested in Italy, on Monday the 21st of March 2014, his trial started in Rome. At this point, Jason Marshall was still claiming to be an MI5 intelligence agent. Psychiatric reports showed that he had a personality disorder, Asperger's syndrome, psychosis and delusions. During the trial, he often became angry, at one stage claiming that he was a reincarnation of Archangel Gabriel. Jason was found guilty of both murder and attempted murder, but due to his psychiatric conditions, he was only sentenced to serve 22 years in prison. We're now on Saturday the 8th of November 2014. It's been almost 2 years since he killed Peter Fasoli. Peter's nephew had some of Peter's belongings that had been salvaged from the fire. And, well, he was making a family tree, so he thought on his uncle's computer there might be some useful things for this family tree. Now, Peter Fasoli was a computer repairman, so it was likely that he'd stored tons of images and stuff on his computer. So his nephew got some of his hard drives and plugged them into his own computer. One of the hard drives were almost full with a video file. So he opened the video and started flicking through it, watching bits as he went on. He soon realised he was watching video footage from inside Peter's flat. He noticed on the night that Peter had died, he wasn't alone. There was another man there. Now I'm not quite sure if it was CCTV, he was filming the interaction with Jason, or it was using a webcam as CCTV, because different sources suggest different things. Either which way, the footage was there, so the nephew phoned the police. Obviously, the police collected the hard drive and watched it back, and irregardless of how or why it was being recorded, Peter had filmed the entire thing, apart from a little bit at the end. Jason had accidentally nudged something while he was rummaging around looking at things, and that had cut the video off, but the audio was still recording. Jason can be heard pouring some sort of fluid around the apartment, then he flushed the toilet, then you can hear the click of a lighter or matches, and then you can hear him walking out and leaving. Needless to say, the investigation into Peter Fasoli's death was reopened. Looking at bank transactions on Peter's credit card, the police saw that after his death, large amounts of money were being withdrawn. Some sources said that Jason bought the flight with a card, others said that he used cash. Either which way, police managed to trace it back to Jason. They found the flight in Jason's name, they knew that he'd left the country. A pathologist found that asphyxiation also contributed to Peter's death. He was still alive, albeit unconscious, when the fire started. And obviously, now, Jason sat in an Italian prison, completely unaware of what's happening at home. So much so that he's working on an appeal to get his Italian prison sentence reduced. And on the 15th of September 2015, he won that appeal. His sentence was reduced to 16 years in prison. Obviously, international policing can be a slow and painful process, but on Wednesday the 15th of February 2017, now 3 years and 1 month since Peter's death, Jason was extradited back to the UK, and as he landed at Heathrow Airport, he was arrested for the murder of Peter Fasoli. On Monday the 31st of July 2017, Jason Marshall's trial started at the Old Bailey in London. During the trial, he denied murdering Peter, and he claimed to be suffering from some sort of amnesia. He had no memory of the events, and the reason he had no memory of the events was because he was in some sort of alcohol-fueled depression, and he was taking medication. He told the jury that he didn't know what happened. He had no memory of meeting Peter Fasoli, or of the events in Italy. I feel bad that somebody died, and it could potentially be me. He admitted that he got pleasure from dominating naked men, while pretending to be a policeman. The judge asked if he'd been trying to terrify Peter, and Jason replied, "Yes, my lord," with a prospect of torture. Just over a week after the trial started, on Wednesday the 9th of August 2017, he was found guilty of the murder of Peter Fasoli. Jason reportedly showed no reaction as the verdicts were delivered. Then on the 26th of September 2017, Jason Marshall was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 39 years. He will remain in prison until he's eligible for parole in 2056. Now, obviously, there are major failing here, and that triggered a new inquest into Peter's death. During the new inquest, a coroner attached no blame to the police or the fire brigade, but he did acknowledge that minor oversights had been made. For example, Peter Fasoli did not smoke, but matches had been found in his flat behind his body. A detective inspector who weren't involved in the original investigation defended the investigation by saying there were none of the classic telltale signs of a deliberate fire. When you have an arson, you usually have a number of places where the fire was started. In this case, there was no evidence of that, or of an accelerant being used. It must have burnt off. The doctor leading the inquest also said that there were no clear evidence that Mr. Fasoli had been restrained. He stated he would have been consenting to everything at first, so there was not any sign of restraint marks during the autopsy. Because of fire damage, any marks had been burned off. After considering the available evidence, my conclusion is that Mr. Peter Fasoli was unlawfully killed, and that completes the inquest. Now, that's all I've got for you. It's not really all I've got for you. There are a lot more information knocking about, but it's quite hard in this case to tell what's been fabricated and what's not. So if I weren't happy that it were factual, if I couldn't find proof, then I left it out. But let's look at that. I mean, so he's got 22 years in Italy, that's been reduced to 16. He's only a year through his prison sentence, and then he gets, 3 years after he'd been extradited and stuff. But now he's got 42 years, 39 years. So, you know what I mean? He's only really had 3 years added on to his sentence. to be out for parole in 2056, he killed 2 people and tried to kill a third. Let's not forget that, because he was very, very nearly a serial killer. If the neighbours hadn't been alerted by his screaming, he would have killed that person, and then he'd officially been classed as a serial killer. And if it weren't for the Italian police already watching him because of the first murder, they might not have caught him in time, and he'd have murdered somebody else. So he was definitely on track to become a serial killer. And it was the fact that the neighbours called it out. It was the fact that the police were so efficient in Italy. And that puts us to shame, to be fair. And there's another thing as well. There's a lot of people that say, there's a lot of news articles and stuff that are going, look, another gay crime that hadn't been looked into. It's homophobic. And I don't think that's the case. I mean, did they even know that Peter was gay when they started investigating it? That's the thing that's got me out. Yeah, it's a massive injustice, but I think it's just a massive failing. I don't think it were homophobic. I just think that the police did a really shit job. I'm sorry if this video's not as good. I've struggled. I've tried to do a different way. I don't think I'm very well, because no matter which way I've tried to film this, it's not gone very well for me. I've currently been studying 4 hours. This video did remind me very much of somebody not that I used to know. I used to do event security, and there was a guy that were a pain in my arse. I was supervising at a big event, and he was a pain in the ass. And then a couple of months later, I was supervising at another event, and he was there. He didn't work for our firm. He worked for someone else's, and he was being subcontracted in. Now, this other event, I didn't realise that he was there. It was still quite a big event, not as big as the first one, but I was on a different side of the site, and he got radioed over his name and to come over. And I thought, oh God, he's not here, is he? Anyhow, like I said, I was supervising again, and next one of the other supervisors or managers, I don't know what she were at the time, came over and said, hey, that kid that you had to put up with at that other event's just got arrested. I says, you what? He says, yeah, that whatever his name is. And I said it. And he says, yeah, he's just been arrested. Did you not hear it on radio? I says, no. And he says, well, yeah. The police came and said, we believe you've got this person working for you. So we looked it up, and we had. So we called him in, and they've just arrested him. Now, I don't know what that's for. I looked him up last night on the news, and apparently he did something else in 2016. This is 2013. But he'd done the same thing. He was apparently from the US Embassy's security, and he was protecting someone's daughter and something. He handcuffed someone inside a lift. He offered the receptionist £50 if she'd take her pants off. Yeah, so I have been exposed to people that like to impersonate police. Very weird. I do think it's very weird. Obviously, for Jason's case, he had a lot of mental issues. And that doesn't justify it. It really doesn't. But, wow. Just wow. Wednesday, there will be a Stranger in Fiction. See you then.